Well, good morning once again. I was just glancing at my watch and realizing that I'm beginning my sermon at a very holy moment. The KU Stanford game just started. I want to begin this morning by sharing with you some of the results of a major comprehensive poll that ABC and Gallup did last fall, looking at a variety of different opinions held by Americans across the country, dealing with issues of gender and race, religion, politics, immigration, and so on. You'll not be surprised to discover that we have polarized views in this country on a lot of those issues. The poll found vast differences among groups in things like trust in government, immigration policy, and beyond, including basic views on such issues as the role of religion in society, the value of diversity in politics, treatment of women in the workplace, and the opportunities afforded to minorities in society more broadly. The gaps in nearly all cases are largest among partisan and ideological groups, so enormous, so fundamental that they seem to constitute visions of two distinctly different Americas. Now, statistics and percentages don't preach very well, so I'm not going to bombard you with those, but I do want to share a couple of things because I think they're revealing and interesting about where we are as a nation in the year 2014. The poll found that among all adults that were surveyed, a little more than half, 53%, think women have fewer opportunities than men in the workplace. But that ranges from 68% of Democrats to 38% of Republicans, a difference of 30 percentage points. Comparing the most unlike groups, liberal Democrats and conservative Republicans, it's 76 to 35%. Here's another one. 41% overall think that non-whites have fewer opportunities than whites in society. 56% of Democrats say so, as do 62% of liberal Democrats, more than the number of non-whites themselves, who say 51%. But among Republicans, that dives down to 25%. Just one other one. Fewer than half of all adults, 45%, say political leaders should rely somewhat or a great deal on their religious beliefs when making policy decisions. But again, the range is wide. 6 in 10 conservatives, as many Republicans, and 65% of conservative Republicans hold this view. But that falls sharply to 39% of Democrats and independents alike. So 4 in 10 moderates and 32% of liberals. Okay, that's a lot of numbers. Why am I sharing this with you? When the gospel reading was read this morning, it was probably assumed by everyone in this room that it's a story about Jesus showing compassion to a woman who was outside of the mainstream. She was a Samaritan, which meant she wasn't Jewish, and she had kind of a checkered past, that business about the 5 husbands. And so on the surface it seems like, well, this is just another nice story of Jesus being inclusive and loving, and let's all hold hands, right? But I'm here to suggest this morning that this story is actually about something very different. And all clergy know this because we learned it in seminary. They're probably not preaching on it this morning, but this is actually a story about the geopolitics and the divisions that existed in the world of Jesus and his followers at the end of the first century. You see, traditional voices, and of course, historically those have been male voices, have overwhelmingly seen this Samaritan woman primarily in sexual terms, as one who flaunts her sexual immorality. But I'm here to suggest this morning that a true reading of John's Gospel leads to a different conclusion. And we discover that this message that the Gospel writer John is sharing is one that is much deeper and much more complicated and very sophisticated theologically. And so let's begin at the beginning. There are certain clues and symbols in this story that we need to get a handle on to understand what the Gospel writer is talking about and the point that he's trying to make. The first thing that needs to be grasped or understood is that in the Hebrew Scriptures, a well is the place where one goes to search for a wife. And the reference to Jacob's well in the text this morning, John 4:12, makes this abundantly clear. It also signals that this narrative is not the recollection of an actual event, but rather it's a story that the gospel writer has crafted and designed to provide new insight into the Jesus experience. So let's take a look at the meaning of what this well business is all about. As the place to seek a wife, we need to be familiar with some of the folk tales of the Jewish people. For example, in the book of Genesis, you can look if you want to there in chapter 24, there's the story about Abraham, the patriarch. He sends his senior servant to find a wife for his son Isaac. He doesn't want Isaac to marry a Canaanite, we're told, that is one from among the people whom Abraham is currently living with. And so this servant of Abraham is dispatched to Abraham's place of origin back in Mesopotamia to find a wife among Abraham's own people for his son Isaac. The only criterion in the story is that the woman of choice must be willing to return with Abraham's servant. So the servant is equipped with provisions for the journey. Gifts of gold, a large entourage of support people, and a train of 10 camels. They journey east to Mesopotamia to the town of Nahor, and they arrive at a well to which the women of the village come each day to draw water for their households. Now the servant is instructed to follow a carefully set script in looking for a suitable woman. He is to ask each woman he singles out to give him a drink. If one does so, in addition, he offers to water the camels. She's the one. The suggestion is that God is in control and will control the choice through these requirements. So the story goes along. A young woman arrives. She is described as fair to look upon and a virgin to whom no man has known. Now, the text doesn't say how this fact was determined, but nevertheless, it was a precondition of the mating process. Her name, we learn, is Rebecca, and she follows the script implanted in the servant's mind perfectly. The servant asks her for a drink, and she gives it to him. She then proceeds to water his camels. He inquires as to her identity and asks the name of her parents. He thus discovers that she is the granddaughter of Nahor, after whom the town is named, who was also the brother of Abraham. So believing that God has blessed his journey, the servant completes the courtship by giving Rebecca a gold ring, 2 gold bracelets, and asks her if he can find lodging in her father's home for the evening. So, as the story goes on, we learn that the arrangement, the betrothal is made, and it concludes with all of them having a big feast accompanied by much wine. They were obviously not Southern Baptists. The place of the well as the setting for a marriage contract is reiterated again and again in the Hebrew Scriptures. And let me give you just a couple of other quick references. If we skip ahead 5 chapters in the book of Genesis, chapter 29, there's the story of Isaac and Rebekah's son, Isaac, who also is in need of finding a wife for himself. And he goes off back to Mesopotamia to find a wife for himself. It's the story of Jacob and Rachel. And then again, beginning the book of Exodus, chapter 2, same sort of thing. Moses is in need of a wife. Where does he go to find one? He goes to the well. And there he meets Zipporah. So as these examples show, in the Scriptures, when a man and a woman meet at a well, the encounter is viewed as a mating game. I want you to keep that in mind and listen to these familiar themes as John's story about the Samaritan woman at the well develops. You see in the story, John chapter 4, Jesus apparently is traveling alone from Judea in the south to Galilee up in the north of Israel. And while doing so, he comes to the town of Sychar in the region of Samaria, and he stops to rest by a well known as Jacob's Well. It's high noon. Samaritan woman won't come to Jesus by night as Nicodemus did. She'll come in the clear light of the midday sun. She is about the routine task that women in that culture normally performed. She comes to draw water that will sustain not only her life, but the life of her family. Then Jesus, using words identical with those used by the servant of Abraham in Genesis 24, in search of a wife for his master's son Isaac, Jesus asks her for a drink. Jesus is thus cast by the writer of the fourth gospel in the role of the bridegroom, inviting the Samaritans to become a faithful constituent part of the new Israel, another name for the developing Christian covenant. The Samaritan woman then, recognizing that what is really happening is a courtship, remember it's symbolic, cuts immediately to the chase, places into the conversation the history of the fracture between the Jews and the Samaritans. How is it, she asks, that you, a Jew, ask a drink of me, a woman of Samaria? The author explains that history briefly, noting that Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. Well, why didn't they have any dealings? Well, this fracture had its origins way back in Jewish histories, more than 900 years before the time of Jesus, in the secession from Judah of the 10 northern tribes, the northern kingdom of Israel, in the year 920. This happened right after the death of King Solomon and the kingdom fractured. That fracture meant that the northern part of the Israelite nation, which came to be called Samaria, separated itself literally and figuratively from the house of David, the city of Jerusalem, and the temple with its high priest who controlled the ecclesiastical structures. As they tried to define themselves against Jerusalem, more and more these people of the north, they saw themselves related primarily not to the royal house of David, but rather to the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, who had changed his name to Israel, you'll recall. The rivalry between these two parts of what was once a single nation was intense. Hatred based on this rivalry was deep. Prejudices developed that fed the survival needs of each. And if you think about it, if you look back at history, that's kind of the way human life works, doesn't it? You've seen it throughout history as the world has been regularly divided into competing groups with competing loyalties. We see it in our own country. Christian against pagan, Catholic against Protestant, true believer against heretic, white against people of color, males against females, heterosexuals against homosexuals. In the insecurity of human life. Our desire is to build ourselves up by tearing our rivals down. Citizens of Israel define themselves against the citizens of Judah and vice versa. Each region's self-definition thus set the two states in constant tension and conflict with one another. Well, all of these feelings are captured in our story this morning, in this Johannine episode, when the Samaritan woman responds to Jesus' request for a drink of water at the well of Jacob, by shifting the conversation to the gaping divide between Jews and Samaritans. And from that moment on, the conversation between Jesus and the Samaritan woman is a deep theological conversation about human boundaries and what role this Jesus would play in the world of human tensions. So the woman's hostile question as to why he, a Jew, would ask her, a Samaritan, for water, Jesus responds with a new invitation. He offers her living water, which is a synonym for the Spirit of God. Living water that binds human life together. The woman, not yet understanding the dialogue, notes that he has nothing with which to draw water from the well. His offer thus seems to her to be an empty one. Then she asks him the key question. Are you greater than our ancestor Jacob, who gave us this well? And note the pronoun here, our. She's identifying herself with the ancient covenant made with the patriarchs. The Samaritans, after all, were part of that covenant since they were descendants of Jacob. Well, Jesus responds once more by lifting the conversation beyond this ancient division. Jacob's well provides water that sustains life, but only momentarily, says Jesus. Those who quench their thirst with waters from Jacob's well will thirst again, he says. But Jesus is offering a kind of water that causes people to become so whole, so complete, that they'll never know thirst again. The woman, intrigued by this image, but still bound by her limiting literalism, says in effect, this is a wonderful vision. Give me this water, and I'll never have to come here to draw water from this well again. I will, in effect, transcend, grow beyond Jacob. Now remember, this woman is a mythological symbol of Samaria. This is a symbolic conversation between how the estranged region of Samaria can be incorporated into the new understanding of Christianity in Jesus. And it's believed by this gospel writer that Jesus is to be present and within these ancient religious divisions in the human family. That in this Jesus they can be overcome in the new human consciousness that Jesus comes to bring. Sir, the Samaritan woman then says, I perceive that you are a prophet, so tell me where and probably how people ought to worship. She's asking him to identify where the true place of worship is, because the Samaritans thought that you should worship up on the mountain, Mount Gerizim, but the Jews thought they should worship at the temple down in Jerusalem. But Jesus asserts that God's beyond that kind of human limitation. God is spirit, says Jesus, unbound and permeating everything. And those who worship this God must do so in truth and spirit. Again, the dialogue makes little sense so long as we assume that the Samaritan woman is a real person. She's not. She's a symbol. In this narrative, she's a symbol of Samaria itself. So Jesus is proclaiming that even those considered worthy of rejection by the Jews are to be included in the realm of God to which Jesus is beginning to open. One final point. You need to ask yourself the question, what then is this story saying about the woman's 5 husbands? Remember that part? The reference is actually to a Hebrew text, 2 Kings chapter 17, in which we are told that the kings of Assyria, who were the mortal enemies of the northern kingdom, who had invaded and destroyed the northern kingdom in the early 700s BCE, they brought people from 5 countries and placed them in the cities, the regions of Samaria. So from the point of view of the people of Judah, those southerners, they began to be called Jews about the same time. But they began to see the people of the north as sort of a mixed race, a mongrel nation, and their religious practices began to be syncretized with foreign ideas in which the purity of Israel's ancient faith was to believed rather to have been badly compromised. That's all that language and all those stories about Baal and all that other stuff. So, both race and religion became barriers to unity and developed as sources of enormous prejudices between these two people. These were the 5 husbands of the unfaithful Samaritans, those foreigners who had been settled in their lands by the Assyrians, symbolized by this Samaritan woman. This story, then, is not about sexual immorality, even though that's what every sermon across the nation on this text is saying right now. It's rather about faithfulness to God, who draws us beyond human barriers, human divides, and human prejudices. Meanwhile, the Samaritan woman, ecstatic over what she has heard, leaves her water pot right there to, in essence, become an evangelist, just as John and James had left their fishing nets to follow Jesus. The mission to the Samaritans is now in the hands of a woman, meaning that another barrier to oneness in the human family is being overcome. The Samaritan woman becomes a herald of this new revelation, just as later Mary Magdalene will become a similar herald of the resurrection to the disciples. So friends, I'll conclude with this thought this morning. We need to understand that this Jesus was and is a barrier breaker. Before him falls the human division, first between Samaritans and Jews, but then between race and religion, and also between women and men. A vision of the realm of God, what the gospel writers call God's kingdom, comes into view. That's the vision that you and I are called to proclaim as well, and to make real in our lives and our world. Let us pray. O Lord our God, you call us to unity and oneness, just as you are one. You call us to recognize the image of you in our neighbor. But that is something that we humans have had tremendous difficulty doing down to our own time. Lord, help us to recognize that we're all created of the same stuff. We all have the same DNA. We all have the same needs, wants, and desires. Help us to grow beyond those who are in, those who are out, those who are an enemy, those who are friends. And help us to understand that we are all one in you. We ask it in your name.